The death of a love like theirs was not a sudden, violent thing. It was a slow cooling, a creeping frost that began at the edges and worked its way inward until the heart of it, once a blazing star, became a thing of ice and memory. Isla felt it as a physical ache, a permanent chill beneath her ribs that no fire could warm. She stood now in the Hall of Echoes, a name that felt cruelly appropriate, watching her husband, the vampire king Adrian, hold court. Not on his throne, but in the center of a glittering throng of visiting dignitaries, his laughter a rich, dark velvet that wrapped around a laughing duchess from the sunken aisles. The duchess was beautiful, of course. They always were. Her skin was the color of warm sand, and her eyes were chips of obsidian that caught the candlelight and threw it back, brighter. She laid a hand on Adrian's arm, a gesture of casual intimacy that sent a fresh wave of ice through Isla's veins. He didn't pull away. He never did. It was diplomacy, he always said. A soft touch, a charming smile. These were tools as vital as a sharpened sword or a signed treaty. But Isla had watched him wield these tools for 2 centuries, and she knew the difference between the performance of charm and the genuine warmth he reserved for those who truly captured his interest. The line had blurred, then vanished altogether. Isla wore a gown of midnight silk, the fabric a cool weight against her skin. A constellation of diamonds glittered at her throat, a gift from him to mark the anniversary of their alliance, an event that had happened 3 weeks ago and which he had only remembered when his steward reminded him that morning. The necklace felt less like a gift and more like a gilded apology, a beautiful, cold, and silent admission of his neglect. She raised a hand to touch the stones, her fingers tracing the sharp facets. They were as brilliant and as lifeless as his smiles had become to her. He had conquered kingdoms for her, laid the heads of his enemies at her feet. In the early centuries, his devotion had been a firestorm, a magnificent, terrifying force that had remade the world around them. He had listened to her counsel, valued her mind as much as her beauty, and sought her presence as a flower seeks the sun. They had been a single entity, a king and queen who ruled not just a kingdom, but each other's hearts. But peace, it turned from a balm into a slow-acting poison. With no wars to fight, Adrian had turned his strategic mind to the endless, glittering game of court politics. The game required charm, flattery, and the undivided attention of the king. And Isla, his constant, his unwavering North Star, had become part of the landscape, beautiful, admired, but ultimately taken for granted. Assumed. Her sacrifices had become invisible. The sleepless nights she spent poring over trade agreements so he could rest, the careful diplomatic ties she nurtured with the more conservative houses who distrusted his progressive streak. The quiet comfort she offered him when the weight of the crown grew too heavy. These were things she did in the shadows, acts of love that required no audience. And because they were quiet, he had stopped seeing them. He saw only the seamless functioning of his court, the placid surface of his kingdom, and assumed it was the natural state of things. He had forgotten the tireless work that went on beneath the water to keep the ship of state afloat. Her love hadn't vanished in a single dramatic moment of betrayal. It had been eroded, worn away by 1,000 tiny disappointments. A promised evening walk forgotten in favor of a game of strategy with his general. A shared jest with a foreign ambassador while her own words went unheard. The way his eyes would skim over her in a crowded room, searching for the next conversation, the next political conquest. Each instance was a grain of sand, insignificant on its own, but together they had built a desert between them. Tonight, watching him with the Duchess, Isla felt the last of it give way. It wasn't anger that flooded her, or even jealousy. It was a profound and hollow emptiness, a resignation. She had been holding a torch for him in the darkness for so long, and she had finally realized her own hands were burned and the torch had gone out. There was nothing left to burn. She lowered her hand from her throat and smoothed the silk of her gown. The decision, when it came, was not a storm. It was a quiet click, the sound of a lock turning for the final time in a door that would never be opened again. She would no longer offer her heart to be ignored. She would no longer offer her counsel to be dismissed. She would give him exactly what he had given her. Polite, respectful, and utter distance. She would become the perfect, spectral queen, a beautiful adornment for his court, and nothing more. Without a word, she turned from the spectacle, her back straight, her steps measured, and walked out of the hall, the sound of his distant laughter echoing behind her like the memory of a song she could no longer quite recall. The next morning, the change began. Adrian awoke to the scent of winter air and solitude. The space beside him in their vast bed was cool, the sheets smooth and undisturbed. For a moment, he was merely disoriented. Isla was always there when he woke, a warm, breathing presence that had anchored his mornings for centuries. He sat up, the silk coverlet pooling around his waist, and saw her side of the room was immaculate. Her silver-backed brush was perfectly aligned with its comb on the vanity. The book she'd been reading was closed on the nightstand, a ribbon marking a page she would likely never return to. There was no sign of her. He found her at breakfast, not in their private dining chamber, where they usually shared a quiet meal, but in the great hall, seated at the far end of the long, empty table. She was a solitary figure in the cavernous space, a cup of tea steaming gently before her. She was already dressed in a severe but elegant gown of dove gray, her hair intricately braided and pinned. She looked regal, composed, and 1,000 miles away. "Isla?" he said, his voice echoing slightly in the hall. She looked up, and for a heartbeat he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a deep, ancient sorrow that startled him. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a placid mask of courtesy. "Good morning, my king," she said. Her voice was calm, her tone even. She used his title, something she only did in formal court settings. He frowned, walking toward her. "Why are you down here? I was expecting you." "I woke early and didn't wish to disturb you," she replied, taking a delicate sip of her tea. Her gaze was fixed on the space just past his shoulder. "I had the kitchen send your breakfast to your chambers." The correction was so subtle he almost missed it. To your. He stopped a few feet from her, an unsettling feeling coiling in his gut. "Is something amiss?" "Not at all," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. It was a perfect, polite curve of her lips, a thing of artifice. "The day is clear. The trade delegation from the Northern Shires arrives this afternoon. I have already reviewed the preliminary terms. They are acceptable, with minor adjustments to the tariffs on lumber." She was reporting to him, like a minister, not like his wife, his partner. He waited for her to elaborate, to offer her strategic insights, to point out the subtle traps she was so good at spotting. But she said nothing more, simply returning her attention to her tea. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant clatter from the kitchens and the ticking of the great clock in the entryway. It was not the comfortable silence they had always shared. This was a void, a chasm of unspoken things. The day continued in the same unnerving key. At the council meeting, she sat at his side as always, a silent, graceful statue. When he asked for her opinion on the Northern Shires Treaty, she simply said, "The terms are as we discussed. I have no further comment." Her voice was a placid stream, betraying no current of emotion. The council members exchanged uneasy glances. The Queen's sharp insights were legendary. Her silence was a political event in itself. Adrian found himself watching her, trying to decipher the unreadable calm of her expression. He looked for a sign of anger, of hurt, of anything. He found nothing. She was a placid lake, her depths hidden and still. He tried to catch her eye, to share a private look of understanding or exasperation as Lord Valerius droned on about shipping lanes, but her gaze remained fixed on the documents before her, her focus absolute and impenetrable. That evening, he sought her out, finding her in the royal library. She was not reading, but staring out the great arched window at the rising moon. The silver light traced the line of her profile, making her seem ethereal, untouchable. Isla, he began, his voice softer this time. We need to talk. If I have done something to offend you. She turned to face him, her expression unchanging. You have done nothing, Adrian. You are the king. Your duties are demanding. She spoke the words as if reciting a catechism. There was no accusation, no bitterness. There was nothing. It was the nothing that terrified him. Anger he could fight, tears he could soothe, but this absolute hollow civility was a fortress he could not breach. This isn't like you, he pressed, taking a step closer. You are my wife. I am your queen, she corrected him gently, her voice as soft as falling snow. And I will always perform my duties to the crown and to you, its bearer. You need not worry on that account. She gave him a small, formal nod, a gesture one might give a stranger. Now, if you will excuse me, I am tired. I will be retiring for the night. She moved to walk past him. He instinctively reached out, his hand closing around her arm. For a single, breathtaking moment, he felt her go rigid, a tremor running through her. It was the first genuine reaction he had gotten from her all day. But then, she relaxed, her body going pliant but unresponsive in his grasp. She did not pull away, she simply waited. Her patience was more damning than any struggle. He was holding her, but he was not touching her at all. The realization was a cold shock. Slowly, his fingers uncurled. He let his hand drop to his side, defeated. She continued on her way without a backward glance. He listened to her footsteps recede down the long, marbled corridor until they were swallowed by the vast silence of the castle. He was alone in the moonlight, the chill of her absence a palpable thing. He had thought her love was a given, a fundamental law of his universe, as constant as the tides. He was only now beginning to understand the terrifying truth, that even stars could burn out, leaving nothing behind but cold, empty space. And he was standing in the darkness, utterly lost. The request came 6 days into the new, cold regime. It was delivered not by Isla herself, but through the Lord Chamberlain, a fussy, ancient vampire named Elian, whose entire existence was dedicated to protocol. The formality of the act was a calculated blow, and Adrian felt its impact like a physical strike. He was in his study, reviewing border patrol reports, when Elian entered, bowing so low his silken robes whispered against the floor. Your Majesty, the Chamberlain began, his voice a dry rustle of old parchment. I have a formal petition from Her Majesty, the Queen. Adrian put down his quill, the black ink staining his fingertips. A petition? Isla knows she need only speak to me. The words sounded hollow even to his own ears. She was not speaking to him, not in any way that mattered. Elian cleared his throat, avoiding Adrian's gaze. He held out a rolled scroll, tied with a simple silver ribbon. Her Majesty felt, given the nature of the request, that observing the proper channels was appropriate. Adrian's hand was steady as he took the scroll, but a knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He broke the wax seal, which bore the Queen's personal sigil, a solitary moonflower. The parchment was cool and smooth beneath his touch. Her handwriting was as it had always been, elegant, precise, and perfectly controlled. The words were few, but they carried the weight of a final judgment. To His Royal Majesty, King Adrian, I, Queen Isla, do formally request the allocation of the Sunset Wing for my personal and permanent use. All necessary arrangements for the relocation of my effects will be handled by my staff so as to cause minimal disruption to the royal household. I trust these new accommodations will be satisfactory to the Crown. Respectfully, Isla. He read it twice, then a third time, the formal, detached language searing itself into his mind. The Sunset Wing. It was the most remote part of the castle, a beautiful but isolated set of chambers that overlooked the western cliffs. It had been unoccupied for centuries, a place of quiet solitude, a place for someone who wished to be utterly, completely alone. Permanent use. The word was a death knell. This wasn't a request for space after a quarrel. This was a severing. A quiet, bureaucratic declaration that their shared life was over. The life he hadn't even realized he was destroying. Satisfactory to the crown, he whispered, the parchment crinkling in his tightening grip. She was framing this as a matter of state, a logistical arrangement. She had stripped every ounce of personal feeling from it, leaving only the cold, hard bones of protocol. It was brilliant. It was devastating. It left him no room to argue, no emotional appeal to make. To deny the request would be petty and controlling, an act of a tyrant, not a husband. To grant it was to sign the death certificate of their marriage. "Your Majesty?" Elian prompted softly, his old eyes filled with a pity Adrian could not bear to see. The terror that had been a distant flicker was now a raging inferno in his chest. It was real. This was happening. The polite smiles, the silent meals, the empty space in his bed, they weren't a passing mood. They were symptoms of a disease he had failed to notice until it had reached its terminal stage. His neglect hadn't just hurt her, it had annihilated her love. He had been a fool, a blind, complacent fool, basking in the warmth of a sun he never thought could set. Now, he was facing an endless night. He looked at the request again, at her perfect, cold signature. He could picture her writing it, her face a mask of calm control, her heart a frozen sea. She had built a wall of ice around herself, and he was on the outside, with no idea how to break through. Panic clawed at his throat. He had to do something. He had to fix this. "Tell the Queen," he started, his voice rough. He stopped, forcing himself to take a breath, to push down the wave of desperation. He could not afford to appear weak, not to Elian, not to the court. He was still the king. "Tell the Queen her request is granted. The Sunset Wing is hers. See to it that her every comfort is provided for." Elian bowed again, a flicker of surprise in his eyes that Adrian had acquiesced so quickly. "At once, Your Majesty." The chamberlain retreated, leaving Adrian alone in the sudden, crushing silence of his study. He sank back into his chair, the scroll still in his hand. He had done the only thing he could do. He had given her the space she asked for. But as he stared at the words she had written, a terrifying realization dawned. He had just given his queen the one thing a king should never surrender: territory. He had ceded the most important ground in his entire kingdom, the space beside him. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that winning it back would be the greatest war of his long, immortal life. In the days that followed, a quiet, efficient army of servants descended upon the Sunset Wing, transforming it from a place of dusty memory into a sanctuary for their queen. Adrian watched from a distance, a ghost in his own castle, as her life was systematically packed into crates and moved across the chasm that now separated them. He saw her books being carried away, their leather-bound spines a silent testament to the thousands of nights they had spent reading together by the fire. He saw her celestial charts, her easel, her collection of pressed flowers from the shadow fen. Each object was a memory, a piece of their shared history being archived and stored away. His first attempts to breach her fortress of solitude were clumsy, born of panic rather than understanding. He thought in terms of grand gestures, the way a king solves a problem, with a demonstration of power and wealth. He sent a torrent of gifts to the Sunset Wing, a string of black pearls, each the size of a robin's egg, that had once belonged to a siren queen. A first-edition volume of poetry by a long-dead elven mystic bound in unicorn hide. A dozen crates of the finest blood wine from the southern vineyards. The response was always the same. A formal, written note of thanks would arrive via a page boy. "Her Majesty thanks the king for his generous gift. It is much appreciated." The notes were penned by her lady-in-waiting, not even by Isla herself. The pearls were never worn. The book remained unread. The wine was likely served to her guards. The gifts were not offerings of love. They were monuments to his misunderstanding. sitting in her chambers as cold and useless as his apologies. Thwarted, he shifted his strategy to public displays. At the next formal court assembly, he stood before the assembled nobility and delivered a soaring speech in her honor. He spoke of her wisdom, her grace, her unwavering support of the crown. He called her the heart of the kingdom, the anchor of his soul. He had the court bard compose a ballad, her praise. He decreed a week of festivities to celebrate her. Isla stood beside him through it all, the picture of regal grace. She accepted the accolades with a serene, distant smile. She inclined her head at the right moments, her posture perfect, her expression placid. To the court, she was the embodiment of queenly dignity. But to Adrian, who watched her with a desperate, hungry attention, her performance was a masterpiece of emotional absence. He was praising a statue, and the statue was playing its part beautifully. Her eyes, when they met his, were polite, patient, and utterly empty. She was enduring his praise, not receiving it. The grander his proclamations, the smaller and more distant she seemed to become. He was shouting his devotion across a canyon, and the only thing that came back was the echo of his own voice. The festivities felt like a funeral. The entire court was celebrating a queen who, to all intents and purposes, was already gone. Adrian moved through the balls and banquets in a daze, the laughter and music a jarring counterpoint to the silent scream of failure in his own mind. He was losing her. With every jewel, with every public pronouncement, he was pushing her further away, proving that he still didn't understand the nature of his crime. Her wound was not one that could be healed with pearls or poetry. He had starved her of attention, of presence, of genuine connection, and he was trying to fix it by throwing things at her from a distance. He was a fool. The realization came to him late one night, during the final banquet of the celebratory week. He was seated on his throne, Isla on hers beside him, a sliver of empty space between them. He was watching her as she listened politely to an old duke recounting a tedious story about a hunt. Her focus was absolute, her smile gentle. She was giving this doddering old man more genuine attention than she had given him in weeks. And it was in that moment that he finally understood. It wasn't about gifts. It wasn't about praise. It was about time. It was about presence. It was about the quiet, unglamorous, day-to-day work of being with someone. The shared silences, the private jokes, the simple act of sitting in the same room, breathing the same air. That was what he had squandered. That was what he had withdrawn from her, piece by piece, in favor of his endless political games. And that was the only currency she would accept. His time. His undivided, undistracted, unconditional presence. The one thing a king had in shortest supply. And the one thing he was now willing to sacrifice everything to give her. The next morning, Adrian summoned an emergency session of his inner council. They gathered in the strategy room, a stark, circular chamber dominated by a massive stone map of the continent. His most trusted advisors, General Valerius, the formidable head of his armies, Lyra, his shrewd, silver-haired spymaster, and old Lord Alara, the keeper of the kingdom's laws, stood, waiting, their faces etched with concern. An unscheduled meeting of this nature usually meant war or rebellion. Adrian stood before them, not in his royal regalia, but in a simple black tunic. He felt stripped down, his purpose clear and sharp. "There is a crisis in this kingdom," he began, his voice calm and steady, resonating in the stone chamber. "It is not a threat on our borders or a conspiracy in our streets. It is a failure of the crown. My failure." The council exchanged uneasy glances. Valerius shifted his weight. "Your Majesty, I don't understand." For years, Adrian continued, his gaze sweeping over each of them, I have allowed the demands of diplomacy and statecraft to consume me. I have attended every summit, every negotiation, every trivial banquet, believing my presence was essential. I was wrong. I have neglected the most important alliance this kingdom has ever known. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. My alliance with your queen. Lyra's expression softened with a flicker of understanding. She had always been fond of Isla. Ilara merely watched him, his ancient eyes discerning. Effective immediately, the crown's priorities are being restructured, Adrian announced. Lord Ilara, you will form a diplomatic corps. I want our 10 most skilled envoys, empowered to negotiate on my behalf at all non-essential summits. Their word will be my word. Lyra, you will ensure they are properly informed and protected. Valerius, you will continue to oversee the security of the realm. Your authority in my absence is absolute. Valerius's jaw tightened. Absence, my king? Where are you going? I am going nowhere, Adrian said. I am staying here. My schedule is to be cleared of all but the most critical affairs of state. No more diplomatic dinners. No more trivial audiences. No more traveling to neighboring kingdoms to flatter their princes. From now on, if a matter is not a direct and imminent threat to the security or prosperity of this kingdom, it is to be delegated. My time is no longer a resource to be spent on stroking the egos of foreign lords. He looked at each of them in turn, his resolve like iron. My time belongs to the queen. A stunned silence filled the room. This was more than a change in schedule, it was a fundamental shift in the way he ruled. For a vampire king, whose reign was measured in centuries, time was the ultimate currency. And he was, in essence, withdrawing a vast fortune from public circulation and depositing it into a private account of one. Lord Ilara was the first to speak, his voice a low rumble. This is unprecedented, Your Majesty. It could be perceived as weakness. A king who retreats from the world stage. A king who cannot hold his own house together is the only true weakness, Adrian countered, his voice sharp. My strength comes from her. It always has. I allowed myself to forget that. I will not make that mistake again. He turned to the great map on the table, his hand sweeping over the vast territories he commanded. None of this, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. None of it matters if I lose her. Delegate, restructure, do whatever you must. Your king has a campaign to wage. And so began the siege. It was a campaign fought not with swords and armies, but with patience and presence. He did not storm the sunset wing or demand her attention. He simply began to appear. He learned her new schedule, the quiet rhythms of her solitary life. He knew she took her morning tea in the western solarium, so he would be there, waiting, with a second cup already poured. He wouldn't speak unless she did. He would just sit across from her, reading a book or reviewing a report, sharing the silence. The first few days, she acknowledged him with a curt nod and left as soon as she finished her tea. But he was there again the next day, and the next. He knew she walked the cliffside gardens every afternoon. He began to meet her there. He wouldn't intrude on her walk, but would simply stand on a distant parapet, a silent, watchful guardian. He wanted her to know he was there, that his thoughts were with her, without demanding she acknowledge him. He was offering his presence as a gift, with no expectation of it being accepted. One evening, he went to the royal library, the place that had once been their shared sanctuary. He took a seat in his usual chair by the fire and waited. 3 hours passed. The castle grew quiet. Just as he was about to concede defeat for the night, the door opened and she entered. She stopped when she saw him, a flicker of surprise on her face. She was holding a book. I thought you would be in council, she said, her voice neutral. The council can wait, he replied softly. He gestured to the empty chair opposite his. I missed this." She hesitated for a long moment, her gaze searching his face. He kept his expression open, vulnerable, making no demands. He simply waited. After a silence that stretched for an eternity, she gave a slow, deliberate nod and walked to the chair. She sat, opened her book, and began to read. He did the same. They sat there for hours, in the warm glow of the fire, the only sound the soft rustle of turning pages. They did not speak a single word, but for the first time in months, they were sharing the same space, the same silence. It was not a victory, but it was ground taken. It was a start. The long, slow work of earning back his queen had begun. Winter descended upon the kingdom, a mirror to the frost that still encased Isla's heart. The days grew short, the nights impossibly long. The castle stones held a permanent chill, and the wind howled off the western cliffs, a lonely, mournful sound. Adrian's campaign of quiet devotion continued, a steady, unyielding pressure against the walls she had built. Every morning, he was in the solarium with her tea. Every afternoon, he was a watchful presence in the gardens. Every evening, he waited for her in the library. Sometimes she came, sometimes she didn't. He never commented on her absence, and he was always there upon her return. He was teaching her a new language, one of consistency and reliability. He was showing her, through action rather than words, that he was not going away. His presence was no longer a thing to be granted at his convenience, but a constant she could depend on. Isla, for her part, remained an enigma. She accepted his presence as she might accept a change in the weather, as a new, unchangeable fact of her environment. She was polite, always. She would thank him for the tea. She would offer a civil nod if their paths crossed. But the warmth, the life, the love that had once animated her every feature remained absent. She moved through her days with a quiet, heartbreaking grace, performing her duties as queen with flawless precision, but her spirit was in hibernation. He would catch her sometimes, staring out a window at the gray, churning sea, her expression so lost and lonely it was like a physical blow to his chest. In those moments, the enormity of what he had broken felt insurmountable. He learned to find solace in the smallest of victories. One morning, she stayed for a second cup of tea. A week later, in the library, she looked up from her book and commented on the passage she was reading, a dry, academic observation about ancient battle formations. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but it was the first one she had initiated in 3 months. Adrian held onto it like a precious ember, shielding it against the wind, terrified it would go out. He brought her small things, not jewels or grand treasures, but pieces of the life they had once shared. A rare winter-blooming moonflower he found clinging to life in a sheltered part of the garden, its petals a pale, ghostly white. He left it on the table in the solarium for her, and the next day he saw it in a small vase on her writing desk. He found a book of star charts, an updated edition of one of their old favorites, and left it for her in the library. He saw her studying it a few nights later, her brow furrowed in concentration. These were not offerings demanding thanks, but quiet signals. I remember. I see you. I know who you are. Still, she held him at arm's length. The door to the sunset wing remained closed to him. They shared space, but not intimacy. They exchanged civil words, but not conversation. He was a fixed point in her orbit, but she was a distant, frozen planet. The months bled into one another, a slow, painful crawl through a season of emotional winter. The court whispered. They saw the king's strange new dedication, his abdication of so many duties. Some called it devotion, others called it madness. Adrian cared for none of it. His world had shrunk to the space between himself and his queen, and the only judgment that mattered was hers, which remained silent. He felt the weight of his own failure every single day. He remembered, with agonizing clarity, all the moments he had let slip by. The times she had come to him, her eyes bright with an idea, only for him to wave her away with a distracted, "Later, Isla, I'm busy." The evenings she had waited for him, only for him to return in the small hours of the morning, smelling of foreign perfume and political victory. He had treated her love like a vault of endless treasure, assuming he could make withdrawals forever without ever making a deposit. Now he stood before the empty vault, a beggar king, with nothing left to offer but his own broken heart. He knew a turning point had to come. This stalemate, this cold war of quiet coexistence, could not last forever. Either the ice would break or it would freeze him out completely. He just didn't know how to force a thaw. Every direct approach he had tried had failed. Every grand gesture had backfired. The only thing that had gained him any ground at all was this silent, patient waiting. And so he waited, through the long, dark winter, hoping for a sign of spring. The breaking point came on a starless, moonless night, when the darkness outside the castle walls was absolute. It was the anniversary of the day they had first met, a day they had always celebrated privately, with no fanfare or public acknowledgement. It had been their secret, a cornerstone of their shared history. Adrian wasn't sure if she would even remember, or if she had buried the memory along with everything else. He didn't go to the library that night. Instead, he was drawn to the old observatory in the highest tower of the castle. It was a place they had built together in their first century, a dome of glass and bronze that looked out upon the heavens. They had spent countless nights there, charting the slow, silent dance of the cosmos, feeling small and infinite all at once. It was a place of beginnings, of shared wonder. It had been abandoned for years. He found her there. She was standing in the center of the circular room, wrapped in a simple dark cloak, her head tilted back as if she could see the stars through the thick blanket of cloud. The air was cold and still, smelling of dust and ozone. The great telescope stood in the center of the room like a silent sentinel from a forgotten age. He didn't speak, just walked slowly toward her. She heard him, of course, but didn't turn. She remained staring upward into the oppressive darkness. "There's nothing to see tonight," she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the cavernous space. A perfect void. Her words were not an observation about the sky, they were a statement about her soul. He stopped a few feet behind her. His heart, a thing that had beat with a steady, immortal rhythm for 1,000 years, felt as though it were cracking in his chest. All the carefully constructed patience, all the kingly composure he had maintained for months, crumbled into dust. The sheer, overwhelming terror of losing her, the crushing weight of his monumental stupidity, rose up and choked him. "I remember the first time I brought you here," he said, his voice raw, stripped of all its usual power and authority. It was the voice of a man, not a king. There was a meteor shower. You were so excited, you grabbed my arm and you didn't let go for an hour. She stiffened, but still did not turn. "I remember," she whispered. "I remember everything, Ela," he went on, the words tumbling out of him, ragged and uncontrolled. "I remember the way you laugh when you solve a particularly difficult cipher. I remember the scent of the night jasmine you used to keep by our bed. I remember the exact shade of gold in your eyes when you look at a sunrise. I remember—" His voice broke. He couldn't go on. He took a ragged breath, the sound harsh in the silence. "And I remember how I forgot," he finally managed to say, the admission costing him everything. "Not all at once, but slowly. I forgot to look. I forgot to listen. I forgot that the greatest treasure in my entire kingdom was not my crown, or my armies, or my name, but the woman who was sleeping beside me every night. I saw you, but I stopped seeing you." He moved to stand beside her, finally looking at her face. In the dim light, he could see the glistening tracks of silent tears on her cheeks. It was the first emotion he had seen from her in half a year, and it shattered him. All the gifts, the speeches, that was just pride, he confessed, his own eyes burning. A king's pride, trying to fix a husband's mistake. It was meaningless. I know that now. He looked away from her, unable to bear the pain in her eyes, a pain he had single-handedly caused. He looked at his own hands, the hands of a king, a warrior, a conqueror. They felt useless. I failed you, he said, the words a quiet agony. Not as a king, as your husband, as the man who swore to cherish you above all else. I let you become lonely in your own home, in your own marriage. There is no excuse. There is no justification. There is only my failure. He finally sank to his knees before her, the ultimate act of surrender for a king. He bowed his head, his forehead almost touching the cold stone floor. End my sorrow. It is all I have left to offer you. The silence that followed was the most profound he had ever known. It was a silence filled with centuries of love and years of pain, of broken promises and the faint, desperate whisper of hope. He remained on his knees, a penitent king, his pride a pile of ashes at his feet, waiting for his final sentence. Ela stood over him, a silent statue in the cold, dark observatory. The tears continued to fall, hot against her chilled skin. Each word he spoke had been a hammer blow against the ice she had so carefully constructed around her heart. For months, she had held on to her pain, nursing it like a fragile, wounded thing. It had been her shield, her armor against any further hurt. His grand gestures had only thickened that ice, confirming her belief that he saw her as a problem to be solved, object to be placated. But this was different. This was not the king. This was Adrian. The man she had fallen in love with, stripped of all his power, all his pride, kneeling before her in the dust and darkness. His confession was not an excuse or a performance. It was a raw, agonizing autopsy of their dead love, and he was holding the scalpel to his own heart. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was simply admitting his guilt, his sorrow a palpable force in the room. Her hand, which had been clenched into a fist at her side, slowly uncurled, a single, trembling finger at a time. She looked down at the top of his bowed head, at the dark hair she had once run her fingers through 1,000 times. The ache in her chest was no longer the hollow emptiness of resignation, but the sharp, piercing pain of a wound being lanced. It hurt, but it was the kind of hurt that precedes healing. Slowly, as if moving through water, she knelt before him. The silk of her cloak pooled around her on the dusty floor. She reached out a hesitant hand, her fingers trembling, and gently touched his shoulder. He flinched at her touch, as if expecting a blow, but did not look up. "Adrian," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. It was the first time she had said his name in what felt like a lifetime. The name itself felt foreign and familiar all at once. He raised his head at the sound of it. His eyes, those powerful, commanding eyes that had stared down armies and bent nations to his will, were filled with a desperate, hopeless vulnerability she had never seen before. He looked utterly broken. "There is nothing left to break," he whispered, as if he had read her mind. "Perhaps," she said, her voice gaining a fraction more strength. "Or perhaps there is something to build." He stared at her, confusion and a fragile, terrified flicker of hope warring in his expression. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," she began, choosing her words with infinite care, "that the love we had is gone. You were right, it died. We cannot go back to it." She saw the hope in his eyes flicker and die, and she hurried on. "But we are here now, in the ruins, and we can either walk away, or we can see if there is anything worth salvaging, if there is a new foundation we can lay." She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. "I am willing to try, to build something new." His breath hitched. "Isla, are you sure?" "No," she answered with brutal honesty. "I am not sure of anything. I am terrified, And I am not forgiving you. Not yet. Forgiveness is a thing that must be earned, not granted on request. Her gaze was steady, her resolve hardening. This will not be easy. It will be slow. And if you ever, for a single moment, retreat back into that complacent king, it will be over. For good. Do you understand? He nodded, a single, sharp movement. He understood completely. This was not an absolution. It was a probation. A fragile, conditional truce. But it was more than he had dared to hope for. It was a chance. Whatever you ask, he swore, his voice thick with emotion. I will do it. I will spend the rest of my life earning this, earning you. Then stand up, Adrian, she said softly, her hand still on his shoulder. We cannot build anything from our knees. He rose slowly, and she rose with him. They stood facing each other in the darkness, the space between them no longer a chasm of cold silence, but a fragile, uncertain ground upon which something new might, with time and immense effort, be built. She did not move into his arms. She did not offer him a kiss. She simply held his gaze, her own eyes clear for the first time in months. The thaw had begun. It would be a long, slow spring, but for the first time she could believe that spring might actually come. The rebuilding was a quiet, painstaking process, like the slow mending of a shattered vase. There were no grand pronouncements, no sudden reversals. Isla remained in the sunset wing, her sanctuary of solitude, but the door was no longer always closed. The change was measured in small, incremental shifts. One evening, instead of waiting for him in the library, she came to his study. She didn't announce herself, just slipped into the room and took a seat by the fire while he worked on a treaty. Her presence was a quiet offering, and he accepted it with a silent, grateful nod, the scratching of his quill the only sound between them. Adrian held true to his promise. He poured his time and attention into her with the same focus and strategic intensity he had once reserved for war. He learned the art of listening, not just to her words, but to her silences. He learned to read the subtle shifts in her posture, the flicker of an emotion in her eyes. He was studying her as he had once studied maps of enemy territory, learning the terrain of her heart all over again. He started asking for her counsel once more, but in a new way. He didn't just present her with a finished plan for her approval. He came to her with the problem itself, laying out the complexities and admitting where he was uncertain. Lord Kale is demanding lower tariffs on his iron exports, he might say, spreading a map on the table between them. Valerius wants to make a show of force. Ilara advises negotiation. I value your thoughts. He was not just asking for her opinion, he was asking for her partnership. He was admitting he was not complete without her. Slowly, cautiously, she began to engage. At first, her contributions were brief, tactical. But as the weeks turned into months, he saw the old fire return to her eyes. She would lean over the maps, her finger tracing a trade route, her mind seeing the intricate web of consequences and possibilities. Kale is a prideful man, she said one evening, looking up from the map. A show of force will only entrench him. But he is also deeply in debt to the Merchants Guild. Offer to guarantee his loans in exchange for the current tariff rates for another decade. He saves face, and we secure our revenue. The plan worked, of course, but the victory for Adrian was not the secured treaty. It was the moment she had looked up at him, her eyes bright with strategic fervor, and for a fleeting second, he saw the woman he had first fallen in love with. He found other ways to show he was paying attention. He remembered a passing comment she'd made about a rare orchid that only bloomed under the full moon. He sent his best scouts to the far reaches of the kingdom, and on the next full moon, a single, perfect blossom was waiting for her on her breakfast table. There was no grand note, just the flower itself. When he saw her later that day, she had tucked it into her hair. The true turning point, the moment the last of the ice finally cracked, came during a tense negotiation with the formidable Iron Clans of the North. Their chieftain, a grizzled old warrior named Borin, was intransigent and openly disrespectful, addressing all his comments to Adrian and pointedly ignoring Isla, who sat at his side. Adrian, in his old life, might have met this aggression with his own, a clash of wills that would end in either submission or bloodshed. But he was a different man now. He listened to Borin's blustering demands, and when the chieftain finished, Adrian didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Isla. "My queen," he said, his voice calm and clear, carrying across the great hall. "You have heard the chieftain's terms. What is your wisdom on this matter?" A hush fell over the hall. Every eye, including Borin's shocked and furious ones, turned to Isla. She met Adrian's gaze, and in his eyes she saw unwavering trust. He was not just including her, he was ceding the floor. He was publicly declaring that her voice was as powerful, if not more so, than his own. Isla straightened in her throne. The queen who had been a polite ghost for so long was gone. In her place was the formidable strategist, the wise ruler who had been dormant for years. She looked directly at Borin, her gaze cool and sharp. "Chieftain," she began, her voice ringing with an authority that silenced all opposition. "You speak of honor, but you offer us a deal with none. You speak of strength, but your position is one of weakness, or you would not be here. Let us speak of what the Iron Clans truly need, not what your pride wishes to demand." She proceeded to dismantle Borin's entire position, piece by piece, not with threats, but with logic, with an intimate knowledge of his people's economic struggles and political vulnerabilities. She offered him a different path, a treaty that would give his people prosperity in exchange for loyalty. It was a masterful performance of diplomacy and power. By the end of it, the blustering chieftain was humbled and grudgingly impressed. He agreed to her terms. As the court filed out of the hall, Adrian remained on his throne, watching his wife. She turned to him, a faint flush on her cheeks, her eyes alive and brilliant. "Well done," he said softly, his voice filled with a profound and genuine admiration. She gave him a small, true smile. It was the first one he had seen in nearly a year, and it was more beautiful than any sunrise. "We were a good team," she said. The word "we" hung in the air between them, a fragile, beautiful thing. That night he walked with her back toward her wing. When they reached the great carved door, he stopped, prepared to bid her good night as he had every night for months. But this time, she did not immediately go inside. She turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Adrian," she said, "the sunset wing is beautiful, but it is very far from the heart of the castle." He held his breath. "It is very far from you," she continued softly, "and I no longer wish to be so far." The relief that washed over him was so powerful, it almost brought him to his knees for a second time. But he remained standing, simply holding her gaze, letting the overwhelming gratitude show on his face. "The king's chambers have been empty for a very long time," he said, his voice quiet. "They are cold." Isla reached out and for the first time took his hand. Her fingers laced with his, a warm, living presence. "Then perhaps," she said, her smile deepening, "it is time someone brought some warmth back into them." He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. It was a gesture he had made 1,000 times before, but this one was different. It was not the possessive act of a king, but the reverent promise of a man who had been to the brink of utter loss and had, by some miracle, been given a second chance. He would not fail again. Their old love was dead, it was true. But here, in the quiet corridor, holding the hand of his queen, his partner, his friend, He knew with absolute certainty that the new love they were building would be infinitely stronger, forged not in the fires of passion, but in the crucible of forgiveness, and tempered by the hard-won wisdom of a love nearly lost. He would never again take her for granted, for he now understood that a queen was not a possession to be adorned, but a kingdom to be cherished, explored, and protected, today and for all their days to come.